All right, guys. There's a story that I think encapsulates everything that's wrong with modern sporting culture, with the tremendous gap in resources here in America between the haves and have-nots, and in the way we consume and deify people that perform at a certain level on the athletic field. And that story that we've touched on here at Higher Learning is what's going on with Brett Favre down in Mississippi and how it's been uncovered that he has colluded to steal from the people of Mississippi. Now, we've talked about this around the edges, but we want to go a little bit deeper into it now that more information continues to come out. That's why we decided to go to somebody who, to be honest with you, knows more about this story than anybody else. Who's in a brilliant, beautiful green room right there as well. Is this Anna? Is this typically the room that you podcast and do your interviews from and stuff like that? This room right here?
This is my new office. Yeah, and I just painted it, and I've got the contrasting colors on here.
It's great.
Oh,
I used to have a roommate, and now I don't. And this is my office now.
There you go. Okay. Anna Wolfe, you are with Mississippi Today. Am I correct on that? Okay.
Yes.
And you were instrumental in breaking the news and getting the information out to the people about the Brett Favre scandal. Thank you for joining us today on Higher Learning. I'll start with my first question for you. Take us to the beginning of this entire thing. When did we first learn about this? And when I say we, I mean you guys down there. What's the genesis of this? How did all of this get started?
So my experience with this story sort of predates the breaking of this scandal. But back in 2018, I took this job at Mississippi Today to cover poverty. And I knew that because there had been a story that came out a short time prior to this, that the state was denying 99% of people who were applying for cash welfare assistance. But I knew that we got that money from the federal government every year regardless. It's a block grant. So it comes from the federal government to the state, and the state can spend it virtually however it wants. And I wasn't able to get any information from the department after records request after records request for expenditure data regarding how we were spending this welfare money. I knew it wasn't going out primarily to people in poverty through direct cash payments. So where was it going? And I pushed and pushed, and fast forward to early 2020, the auditor's office arrested 6 people in connection with a scandal to steal around $4 million from the Department of Human Services. Among the people arrested were the former welfare director, John Davis, and this nonprofit founder, Nancy New, who had really been given the authority to spend a lot of the money. And one of the charges in those indictments in 2020 was that she had embezzled $2 million in this welfare money and put it into a pharmaceutical company called Prevacus, which was developing a cure for concussions, or a drug that would prevent brain damage after a concussion. Pretty quickly on, we were able to tie that company back to Brett Favre, and we broke the first story that illustrated how Brett Favre was actually working with state officials to lure this company to Mississippi, and had been communicating with the governor and the welfare director about this project. And then in that same month, February of 2020, we published a story about how $5 million went to the volleyball stadium. And these are stories that we were just able to put together through sourcing and documents that we retrieved. This was before the auditor had even reported anything about Brett Favre. In May of 2020, he came out with a report that said that Brett Favre himself had received $1 million in welfare payments to basically under a promotional gig to promote the welfare program. Okay, so all of that came out in 2020. Not a lot of fanfare, not a lot of national coverage, right? Fast forward to this year, and we are learning there's been sort of a trickle of information, but we're learning more and more here recently through text messages, both that I obtained and that have been entered into a court filing, that show kind of how Favre was discussing these deals with welfare officials. So, he was He was aware that this money was coming from the Department of Human Services. He was working with John Davis on pulling down this money. And the way that he spoke about it was really like, I'm trying to save myself some money here. Can y'all please help me out? Right. And getting the governor on board in order to make the deals happen.
A lot of people are wondering, because at this point you named Nancy New, you named John Davis. They had been arrested. I think John Davis just pled guilty.
That's
and
right.
We know that they're cooperating right now with the authorities. A lot of people, of course, are wondering, now that this has become more public and the text messages are being released, and it's very evident that Brett Favre was involved, why hasn't Brett Favre been charged or arrested? And I'm also wondering, is there any type of precedent that, the authorities can lean on to show that what has been done before when someone has been misusing government funds for their own personal use or, for a business or something that they're involved in?
Sure. So the federal authorities work very slowly and very quietly. So that is, it's not a very satisfying answer to your question, but it is the truth that these people that I just described who were facing charges and arrested in 2020, they were facing state charges. And the case just kept getting kicked down the road as federal authorities continued to investigate. And John Davis, as you mentioned, not only just pled guilty last week, he was also charged last week for the first time federally. No one in the entire case had received a federal charge until last week, criminal charge until last week against John Davis, and he pled guilty last week. And so that kind of gives you a sense for what the timeline is here. It's not like the feds came in and charged people 2 years ago. Those were state charges. And so now I think you'll see the feds really heating up. We published some text messages that showed that Brett Favre had offered the governor stock in this pharmaceutical company in exchange for his help. And fast forward to 2 days after Phil Bryant left office, he agreed by text message to accept that stock. And in the last year in office, he was receiving updates from Brett Favre about how this company was receiving public money outside of the view of the public. After that story published, Nancy New pled guilty within a few days of the conclusion of that series publishing. So I think what we saw is that the case had really stalled over about a 2-year period until that information was made public and officials could no longer ignore it, right? We can't say what they would have done, what may or may not have happened, depending on, what we did or didn't do. But I think that definitely the idea that they could ignore it, or that they could kind of just, charge Nancy, charge John Davis, let them go to prison, and that be the end of it, wasn't possible after we published those text messages. That was kind of a long-winded way of answering that. As far as the question about precedent, there are Nancy has been charged with RICO, with a RICO charge. It's racketeering. So typically we see when there are these kinds of criminal organizations and enterprises, that's the kind of charge that you're going to be seeing. And so, it doesn't just matter that there was a signature on a piece of paper. Like, you can be charged with participating in a scheme if there is, verbal agreements and especially written communication. So I don't think that anything's out of the question in terms of charges.
Donnie, do you have it ready to go for Anna?
Rico.
That's one of our magic words here. Rico. Everybody say Rico. All right. And I want to come back to this this pharmaceutical company, because I think this is very interesting. As I understand it, with these pharmaceutical companies, is this pharmaceutical company public yet? Were they being publicly traded at the time that Brett Favre was doing this? Was the intent here with Brett Favre and other people to invest into this company that has this drug, take the company public, and then make a shit ton of money? What was the impetus for them to get involved in this? Was he trying to make the people of Mississippi pay for his private investments and enticing others to do that? Is that what I'm to understand here?
I love this question because I don't think I've gotten this question before. And that is absolutely reflected in the text messages. At one point, he said that he expected to make 20 million on the deal, on selling this pharmaceutical drug. At one point, he was asking the scientist who started the company if, how likely it was that this was going to pass, FDA or pass these clinical trials. And the company owner came back and said, if someone dies, we're done. But other than that, we'll keep going and keep raising money.
Anna, quick follow-up. Do you think that the public at large is correctly digesting this story for the monumental graft, sleaziness, just complete disgusting advantage taking of the people of Mississippi that this is beyond measure to me. I've never seen, to me, a public figure involved in the NFL on Brett Favre's level involved in this sleazy and disgusting of a story. I can't remember anyone that's done something like this and been caught for it. Do you feel like this conversation in the news media is being had enough for what this story actually is?
Well, it certainly wasn't. I certainly weren't doing, interviews 6 months ago. Really, I think the national attention has been pretty extraordinary here recently. But as far as digesting the story, I mean, it is that's a tall task for anybody to digest this story. I mean, it is massive. It's sprawling. It ensnared so many people, and there are so many different nuggets to kind of latch onto. So on Saturday, I published a story about a new court filing in the civil case. There's a court battle going on right now between the former governor, Phil Bryant, and the nonprofit founder, Nancy New, about whether or not Phil Bryant should have to release more communication, text messages, these kind of things, related to his involvement with the volleyball stadium, getting $5 million in welfare money to the volleyball stadium. And in those text messages that he entered into court on Saturday, there was a text from Brett Favre to the governor where he said that he was on kind of the next stage of the construction project, and that he needed some lockers to be built at the facility. And he was wondering if Phil Bryant could help him find someone to build the lockers for free, so he didn't have to pay for it, someone to offer their time instead of donating money to get it built, just someone, doing it for free. And then he said that his friend had suggested maybe we could use prisoners to build.
Okay, where's Brett?
Where is he?
Obviously he hasn't given any type of statement, and I'm sure he's being advised not to, but is anybody reporting where Brett is? What's Brett doing with all this attention? I'm just curious.
No, I'm curious too, because, he does do some media, and I haven't seen that he's done any interviews here recently, but I don't know. So he's certainly not talking to me.
I did see that his local hit in Milwaukee, they pulled him off of that. They said no more. They don't want him on doing that anymore. So, maybe all this attention really is starting to have some sort of effect, I guess, as far as the media is concerned, since as Van was pointing out, people weren't covering it in the way that they are now. I guess a follow-up question would be, not to that, but to what I said before. What about Phil Bryant? He hasn't been charged at all. He's clearly former governor is clearly a direct link between Brett Favre and what he was trying to get done and using those funds. What's going on with Phil?
Yeah, and Phil Bryant, he was the governor at the time, and his office oversaw the welfare agency. So, you can even like go back to interviews and hear John Davis, the welfare head, who is probably going to go to prison, talk about how Phil Bryant was his boss and he took orders from Phil Bryant. And so you can't really separate what he was doing, especially when you consider that Phil Bryant was the one setting the tone and setting the goals and the mission of the agency. What kinds of programs what did the state prioritize in the welfare program? That was coming from the governor. So Phil Bryant was very much the subject of the series that we published back in April, where we published text messages about Prevacus and the stock agreement and the way that he was communicating with John Davis, sort of skirting agency guidelines about bidding by suggesting that he go ahead and fund just, whoever the governor wanted him to fund. These kinds of examples that showed how Phil Bryant, wielded his control over this welfare director. Nancy New pled guilty directly after that and agreed to aid prosecution. And so when you think about the chain of command here and who these people might be providing evidence against to prosecutors, the DA of Hinds County said after John Davis pled guilty on Thursday that they were continuing to go through text messages and documents to go higher up the ladder, is the words that he used. He said that John Davis was important because the ladder continues to go up. And so I think that kind of language shows that they really do have their sights set on officials who are higher up the chain. And we'll just have to see how that shakes out,
I want to talk a little bit more about the relationship between Phil Bryant and Brett Favre. From your reporting and what you've uncovered, do you believe that the reason why Phil Bryant decided to endeavor into this predatory theft with Brett Favre was because he wanted to profit financially from the potential business opportunity of the pharmaceutical company, or was he in awe of Brett Favre's standing in Mississippi as the son of Mississippi, Green Bay Packers quarterback, Southern Mississippi quarterback, and that he wanted to do him a solid by getting him the money? Do you have any understanding of what the nature of the relationship between those two men was and why almost $6 million later, Phil Bryant would have done this?
It's pretty hard to try to get into someone's head and speculate on their motives, but just in, reading the communication and kind of seeing how they interacted with each other, I almost feel like this fund was such a target. It was such a slush fund for politicians that it's almost not even like they thought it was a big deal. It's like, oh, Brett Favre wants some money for something. Like, if I help him out, he'll endorse me for my next race, or, he'll be a friend of mine and I can feel important and powerful because I'm friends with Brett Favre. And like, it seems like, why would you risk so much for that kind of personal gratification? But they didn't feel like they were risking that much because that was the culture and that was the kind of the trend and pattern with the way that federal funds were being used at the time, that they felt that they could just use it for whatever they wanted. And so it ends up being that it ends up being that they could, is the answer. They did because they could.
And they didn't care about the people that it was directly impacting, which I want to ask you about this question. You had talked about, I saw it somewhere, about how a certain percentage, was it 99% of the people or whoever was applying to use these TANF funds, they were being denied. And then when the state audit came out, the state audit that was released, I guess, in 2020, said that about $94 million of funds had been misused. And so I guess my question is, when it comes to specifics, like, what does that look like? For those of us who are reading the story, we're not there. When you talk about what was being misused and how these funds weren't being applied for the purpose that they were for, what does that impact look like? What programs weren't getting what they needed? What people were being denied? Because we talk about it in such a general sense, but like, let's talk about, like, let's put a face to it of what that actually looked like for the people who weren't getting the funds that they were supposed to from the government or businesses or organizations, I should say.
I've talked to a lot of people who, maybe at one point had been on this program. In fact, I talked to a woman. Let me give a little positive note really quick. So I talked to a woman recently. I found her because she was used in an advertisement for this welfare program, the Nancy New welfare program. They kind of put her on display and said, this is our model client, right? And it's really interesting because she actually was a TANF client. She was a traditional TANF client. She received TANF cash welfare assistance and was receiving workforce supports, job placement, that kind of thing. And she escaped poverty. I mean, she had this great DHS caseworker who set her up and for success. She got the cash payments to kind of get back on her feet. Now she's like a regional manager at a bank and she's like killing it. In fact, I talked to her not that long ago. She told me that she was coming over to Jackson. She lives about 90 miles away. She was coming over to Jackson to bring bottled water to Jackson. This woman who, right? And so what they did was they put her on a poster basically saying, this is the model client that we're helping through Families First, this like bogus welfare program. But really she was a traditional DHS TANF client, and she was helped and found success through the actual welfare program. Okay, so that's that story. And then I talked to people who around Hattiesburg, when I went down to go see the volleyball stadium for the first time, I kind of hung out and like went around the community and talked to people. And you wouldn't believe the kinds of stories that I've heard about people who had tried to go get assistance from the local community action agencies, like the agency that you go get light bill assistance, energy assistance, or rental assistance, that kind of thing. We found a guy who was just hanging out who told us that he hasn't had running water in his house for a very long time. And we talked to a guy who, and this one is very pointed, had his child taken away from CPS a few years prior to this. And he was homeless at the time. And to get his child back, the court required him to have housing. And he went to the assistance organization and they didn't have any housing available for him. And he never got his kids back. So when you talk about what this looks like for people, you talk about $5 million, what drop in the bucket, right? Life-changing, could have been life-changing for so many people. And you don't get those years back.
Man, when the federal government has a program like this where they're injecting cash into a state, I'm from Louisiana, so I understand, states that need help, people who need help. When the federal government does this, is there no oversight? Is there not anyone that's federally watching to make sure that the funds are allocated properly?
Honestly, not in block grants, which this is one. So block grants go to states and states can develop what's called a state plan around how they're going to spend the money. And that state plan goes to the federal government. And I learned this not that long ago, that the federal government doesn't even approve those plans. They look at them and they see that they wrote a state plan, but the federal government doesn't even have the authority to be like, no, don't pay for a bunch of motivational speakers as your TANF program. Like they don't even have any oversight like that. And then the federal reports that are produced within this program are virtually, they're so vague, you can't even tell what they're saying that the program is. So they just report spending in vague categories like workforce and, two-parent family formation, whatever that means. And there are dollar amounts that are reported in each of those categories, but they don't send any expenditure reports to the federal government so that the federal government can see how they're actually spending the money. There just is not oversight on that level. It's the state auditor that's supposed to be offering that. And it had become such a kind of check the boxes process that the state auditor was doing that they missed all of this misspending until someone finally brought it to their attention.
I have one follow up for you, and it's gonna sound like an odd question, but I don't know why it's jumping out of my skull. The gentleman that you were talking about that lost his children. Do you know whether or not he was a black man?
Yeah.
How much would you say that what Brett Favre and Phil Bryant did affected specifically the black people of Mississippi?
So I don't have a racial breakdown for temporary assistance for needy families, but I know that at one point I read a study that showed that of able-bodied adults on Medicaid in Mississippi, because, you know, we don't have Medicaid expansion. So all of the able-bodied adults on Medicaid are single mothers, right? Or single parents, but typically mothers. And I want to say that the number was in the 90% of people on this program were Black women. And what you see, and this is a national pattern, in states that are more homogenous, in states that have a higher white population, those states have much more generous safety net programs. In states like Mississippi with higher Black populations, that's where you see a legacy, a decades old, hundreds of years old, very punitive policies around federal funds for people in poverty. And it all goes back to these very racist, stereotypical notions about people living in poverty that basically make it suck for everyone. You know, we all suffer because of it. We all suffer because of the racism that has caused this bias and inequity within these systems. But race is baked into this story.
So obviously the officials who were involved, some of them are being charged, some of them have pled guilty, some have not and are under investigation. But at the end of the day, as you just talked about, and these are just a few stories of, I'm sure, thousands of stories, what happens with these people who needed this money, who needed this help, who went and went through the proper channels to get the help that they need? They were denied. Is there any type of restitution process? Is there anything for those who, like, they could track those who applied and were denied and maybe but rightfully did deserve these type of funds? Is there anything that can come about with that?
You know, I thought about this when I was sitting in the courtroom on Thursday. I'm pretty sure, yeah, it was a federal courtroom. And I think the judge had asked if there were any victims in the room. And I was like, oh, well, I mean, that's a standard question, but like, who's here, right? And of course, the victim was the director of DHS. DHS was the victim of this crime. The Department of Human Services was the entity that was stolen from. Of course, you and I are sitting here like that. No, the people were the people in poverty were the victims. But, you know, we had created such strict eligibility guidelines around getting these public funds, this public assistance. And so, you know, when welfare reform happened in the 90s and the TANF program began and replaced the old welfare program, aid to families with dependent children, it was no longer an entitlement. So when you talked about, you know, is there restitution for people? People were never entitled to this money. It literally just wasn't an entitlement. The state had stripped that from people. And so at that point, the people living in poverty were not entitled to it, and it didn't belong to them because that's what the state had done with the program. If that makes sense. I mean, it doesn't make sense, but you know what I mean.
Yeah, no. We got you.
As a resident of Mississippi, are you from Mississippi?
I'm not from Mississippi originally.
Okay. But as a resident of Mississippi, broad question: what's your opinion of Brett Favre? I mean, you're reporting on this, and I'm aware that impartiality is a very important part of your job, and I don't want you to, you know, I'm not asking you to, you know, to cross that line, but I'm asking you, just from what you've seen here, what do you think of Brett Favre?
Yeah, I don't really have any opinions. I'm not, I don't really like hold up people like celebrities like this. So I don't have any like notions that, oh, it's like the fall of this celebrity, or that this celebrity's reputation or their legacy is being tarnished. Like, I don't have any feelings like that about really anyone. So I would just probably leave it at that. I mean, I think I'm disappointed in the communication that I've seen. That has nothing to do with Brett Favre. That just has to do with the fact that someone was capable of manipulating this system in this way.
And for you, it wouldn't have mattered had it been Brett Favre or anybody else. It just happens to be that one of the most famous men in the history of Mississippi is caught up in all of this.
That's right.
My last question. You can't help but look at what happened under former Governor Phil Bryant and Nancy New when she was in office, and John Davis as well, and think that possibly there's more corruption outside of this. Do you know if there's any, and maybe you can't even say, other investigations that are now taking place to look at how they used funds in other ways that might have, been at a disadvantage to the people of Mississippi?
I don't think we're ever going to get to the bottom, the total bottom of this. And that spans, I'm talking about even characters outside of those folks, right? You've got the Medicaid program, you've got DHS, that's the entity we're talking about. Then you've got Medicaid, an even much larger entity that spends federal funds, that is also in Mississippi privatizing. I don't know if I made the point that, these nonprofits had essentially become privatized welfare. And that's how all this money was able to be spent outside of public view, right? Now you've got the state of Mississippi essentially privatizing Medicaid through what are called managed care contracts. That is an entire, I think, untapped well of stories about spending in Mississippi. You've got the Child Care Development Fund. That is a very tangential, it's a very similar block grant to TANF, but it provides the child care voucher to working parents. There was a 5-year period during Phil Bryant's administration where there was not a single new child care voucher offered to low-income parents. And people have reported this, we've reported this, but like, you would not believe, because there's just so much going on, that a fact like that can just go sort of unnoticed. That money was still coming into the state, and some of that childcare money is some of that $94 million that you described was, go into these nonprofits, into these, some of the programs that we've described and are kind of distasteful, but. The Child Care Development Fund is one that I don't feel like there's been a full audit of, right? Like there has been TANF. So, it's pretty much endless.
Last question before I let you go. Thank you so much for your time. I am just sick to my stomach.
I know. I'm sorry for bumming y'all out.
It's okay. No. It's your fault. No, I'm just joking. It's okay. A lot of people have drawn a corollary between what we've seen with the graft and the welfare fund to the water crisis in Jackson, saying that obviously it's glaring that people in Jackson don't. There you go.
Are you in Jackson?
Oh yeah, I live in Jackson.
Right. So that people in Jackson, like yourself, don't have or didn't have running water, had a boil water advisory, and that the state was misusing funds that people in need were supposed to get. Do you see a corollary between a massive infrastructure failing like the Jackson water crisis and this type of fiscal corruption that you're seeing with the Brett Favre story?
100%. I mean, why, and not like I'm saying that TANF money could be used for infrastructure, right? That's not what I'm saying. I'm not saying that the money that was stolen could be used this way, but it's illustrative. You know, Jackson is, okay, so why was like the TANF program so easily manipulated? It's because people living in poverty and DHS clients, they don't have very loud advocates. They don't have a lobby, right? There are no lobbyists who make money off of getting the legislature to pass policies on their behalf, right? That's why you can't see things done for people in poverty. Similarly, Jackson is, you know, it's 80% Black city. It's a city with high poverty rates. And I think that just makes it easier for the state to ignore, just like they ignored DHS clients. You know, when you think about all of the money that the state controls that could have been used to help Jackson get out of this infrastructure hole that we're in, you know, I mean, literal potholes, but also just financially, we're in a little bit of a hole right now with our water system. And the fact that this could go on for so long without the state coming in and providing some of that support, I think is just indicative. Both stories are indicative of the state's regard for people who are suffering.
Anna Wolfe with Mississippi Today. We're going to keep our eyes on this story. We think that it's incredibly important. I think that the magnitude of it can't be articulated enough in terms of, like you said, it's a picture book of how the rich and the wealthy and the privileged sometimes use systems to continue staying that way, and how that affects the have-nots. Fantastic reporting. And I have to ask you about those chairs behind you, though. What the hell is that? Did you go get a roll from the bus station and then put them in your room? You gotta look. If you guys are watching on YouTube or on Spotify, you got like movie theater seats behind.
Okay, go ahead.
Movie theater seats behind you or something like that. What is that? Like, what are those chairs?
These are from an old theater, and I took them from my neighbor's house.
Interesting.
But it's like you go into like some people's houses in Jackson and you'll see these chairs. I don't know. I'm not even sure which theater they came from, but I've seen them in different people's houses. Like clearly the theater was getting renovated and they, you know, gave them away. And so it's just kind of like a fun thing to like be like, oh, I've got some of those, you know?
Yeah, I see him. All right. Well, hope your back's okay.
Green.
All right.
Wait, I get it. I get it
Too. It's eye catching. Anna Wolfe, thank you so much for joining us today on Higher Learning. We hope that we can book you again as more developments come out.
Absolutely. Thank you for caring about the story and about Mississippi.
No problem. Thank you so much.